This is the fourth installment in a series of paintings that were done at night. And all these paintings were done in the Boston area. Watercolors painted on location. Actually, the painting that you're watching is developed in the studio, but based on a experience sketching and painting on location. Today we're at Faneuil Hall Marketplace, which is on the waterfront in Boston. Old marketplace, very active in the evening time, really beautiful. A beautiful summer evening. This is a sketch I've done on my iPad to capture the scene. And working at the iPad at night is great because it's illuminated. You can see what you're doing more clearly. So the watercolor is going to proceed from that. And I'm starting in the sky. I'm going to be doing a couple of washes to get going. What I wanted to talk about tonight was the use of, or the idea of preserving whites. It's a big challenge in watercolor, and people have tried to figure out all sorts of ways to do this, from masking tape to masking fluid to putting stencils down. There's all sorts of ways to preserve the white of the paper. And why is that so important? It's because once the white is covered, it's really hard to get back. You can't really get that pure, bright white back once it's covered. And so, unlike oil painting, the watercolorist needs to make a bit of a strategy to preserve the white. Now, all these whites that I'm leaving, and this is typical in my painting, is these whites will later be accepted. They'll be used as, well, the ones you see now are primarily windows on a building. I'll either keep them to the end of the painting, or at some point I'll mute them or put color in them or paint them out entirely. But I leave a lot of whites through the duration of the painting, and I kind of tie things together towards the end. I like this strategy because of two reasons. One, I've tried masking compound, and I don't like the way it handles. It's not very user-friendly. It's really, I found it difficult to apply and get the sort of interesting shapes that I want. But the second and more important reason is I like to measure my darks against the white. I like to be able to see the white. And when you use masking compound or fluid, very often you cover up those whites with a wash, so you're kind of looking at a gray area. You know that the white will come back, but it's a little harder to measure the color against that. And another reason that's developed out of this technique of just leaving white to the paper as I'm painting along is that the whites I leave can be more lyrical or spontaneous than if I really laid it out and masked each white. The way that this painting is developing is a good example of that. Some shapes were drawn, but most of the whites that you see occur as I'm painting. They speak to me, and I like the pattern that develops, and this has definitely become a working method for me. So look at all these whites that I'm leaving. Some, yes, are windows, some are awnings, some are just shapes. The ones on the lower part that I'm working on now, these are actually puddles. We'd had a huge rainstorm the evening before, and a lot of the pavement was shiny or had puddles, and I thought this might be an interesting characteristic of the evening scene, is to see some reflections in puddles that were remaining from a previous rain. So this is the reason behind all these whites, and at this stage they have a nice musical quality to my eye. I like the way that they're not really forced upon the scene, the way that they kind of have a nice design element to them. So I'm going to try and preserve that through the course of this painting. I've been working primarily wet into wet. You see a lot of soft edges, except around the windows and some of the whites that I'm leaving. Those are hard edges. So I was working on dry paper, but building up the color definitely wet into wet. And working with a dark palette, that's one thing that this series has instilled in me, is that while it's difficult to work on the darker palette with watercolor, there are some advantages and there are some real benefits to doing that. One is the contrast that you're able to achieve and that sense of brilliance that you can do when you reside in the darker side of the palette. I'm using alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue, a little bit of burnt sienna, and a neutral tint, which is basically a black. And this is helping me to get the sort of light against dark, dark against light aspect of the painting, which is crucial for doing a night scene. The strategy in this painting is to place dark figures onto a lit background. So a lot of light in the background, soft light, bouncing light, and this light plus the wet pavement is creating these long reflections that you see in the figures. As I'm painting this, I'm grouping the figures pretty much on the fly. I did draw in these central figures that you see, the lower figures where you see two figures facing each other with a child to the right, but the others were placed rather randomly, and I do this a lot because the painting at some point will start to have a form or a shape, and relating the figures to that shape I feel is important rather than always painting from the drawing. So I've grouped a small group to the midground, a couple isolated figures lower down. This is a good strategy. And a lot of grouped figures, smaller figures, paler figures in the background. And I'm painting them as silhouettes with the intention to go back and add some color on top of this dark color to give it a little bit of life as the painting dries. What you see me working on now is, it looks strange, doesn't it? Like a bunch of balloons. And that's how these lights at Faneuil Hall look. They're very characteristic of this one location in Boston. I've never seen any other place in the world that has this sort of light. So, to my way of thinking, if you would like to communicate, this is the marketplace, the Faneuil Hall marketplace. Nothing says that more than this light configuration that you see above the two figures. I'll repeat that in the background with the second grouping of lights. So you can see how the figures help to create depth in this painting. Main figures in the midground, some close figures at the periphery, and a lot of distant figures. And painting is starting to assume a finished quality. And this is what the painting is going to look like when it's finished. I've added some color to the figures, a few colors to the lights that were in the background, shaped the awnings a little more. You see that distant light. This is Faneuil Hall Marketplace at night, after the rain.